There's a stretch of ocean off the coast of Iran, barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, that has decided the fate of empires for over 500 years without anyone outside a handful of naval strategists ever learning its name properly. Today, roughly 1/5 of all the oil traded on Earth passes through this single corridor. Every major navy in the world has a standing contingency plan built specifically around it. Every oil trading desk on the planet watches it the way a cardiologist watches a heart monitor, because a single statement from a single official on either shore has, on multiple occasions, been enough to move markets thousands of miles away before a single ship has actually been stopped. This isn't a story about a war. It's a story about something older and, in some ways, stranger. How the same narrow passage of water has repeatedly proven, across 5 centuries of Persian, Portuguese, Dutch, British, and American power, that whoever controls a choke point this narrow holds leverage completely disproportionate to the size of the water itself. 3 specific historical episodes make that case more clearly than any abstract explanation could. One from 1988, one from 2011 and 2012, and one from 2019. Each different in cause, each different in scale, and each ending in exactly the same way. This is the Strait of Hormuz. To understand why this specific stretch of water has mattered to so many empires across so many centuries, you have to start with something that predates all of them: the geology that made this choke point possible in the first place. Millions of years ago, the same tectonic collision that built the Zagros Mountains along Iran's southern coast folded the floor of what is now the Persian Gulf into an increasingly narrow basin, squeezing the water flowing between the Gulf and the wider Indian Ocean down to a single constrained corridor. At its tightest point, that corridor narrows to roughly 33 kilometers of navigable water, split further by a formal traffic separation scheme, inbound and outbound shipping lanes running in parallel, each only about 3 kilometers wide, with a narrow buffer zone between them designed to keep opposing tanker traffic from colliding in water this constrained. That leaves an effective width, for the massive vessels that need to pass through it today, considerably tighter than the strait's raw geographic measurement suggests. Geography did something here that almost never happens at this scale. It created a single, unavoidable doorway between one of the richest energy-producing regions on Earth and every market that depends on it. Human beings noticed this doorway long before anyone thought about oil. The Persian Empire, at the height of its power under rulers like Darius and Cyrus, treated the waters around this strait as a core artery of a trade network stretching from Mesopotamia and the Persian Plateau to India and the wider Indian Ocean world. Control of this passage meant control of the tribute, spices, textiles, and information moving between 2 of the ancient world's most significant civilizational zones, and successive Persian dynasties maintained ports and naval presence along this coastline for the better part of 1,000 years, specifically because of what this narrow water represented strategically. That pattern of outside powers, recognizing the strait's value and moving to seize it, repeated itself again and again over the following centuries, but nowhere more dramatically than in 1507, when the Portuguese admiral Afonso de Albuquerque arrived off the coast with a fleet determined to do something no regional power had yet managed: place a European empire directly astride the choke point itself, thousands of miles from Lisbon, at the far edge of what was then the known trading world. Albuquerque's forces seized Hormuz Island, sitting almost exactly at the strait's narrowest point, and constructed a fortress there from the island's own iron red stone, specifically to monitor and tax the maritime trade passing beneath it. For the better part of a century, that fortress functioned as the physical embodiment of a simple strategic principle that would repeat itself for the next 500 years. A relatively small, relatively distant power could project outsized influence over global trade simply by holding the one piece of geography every trading vessel was forced to pass, regardless of how far that power's home territory sat from the choke point itself. Portuguese control eventually gave way to new contests, following the same underlying logic under new management. By the early 1600s, a rising Dutch East India Company, backed by an alliance with Persian forces under Shah Abbas the Great, moved to break Portugal's monopoly over the Gulf trade, culminating in a joint Anglo-Persian siege that expelled Portuguese forces from Hormuz in 1622. Notably, this contest for the strait unfolded against the backdrop of a much larger regional rivalry, the long-running struggle between the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Safavid Persian dynasty to the east for dominance over the broader Middle East, a rivalry that meant Persian rulers had every incentive to court European naval power as a counterweight, even at the cost of ceding commercial control of their own coastline to a foreign trading company. That victory over the Portuguese didn't end outside interest in the strait. It simply transferred the contest to new hands, as Dutch and then British commercial and naval power took turns asserting influence over the same waters in the centuries that followed. The British East India Company, in particular, established a lasting naval presence throughout the Gulf by the 18th and 19th centuries, treating control of these approaches as essential to protecting the sea lanes connecting Britain to its holdings in India, a strategic priority that persisted well into the 20th century, even as formal colonial structures elsewhere began to dissolve. Each successive power was drawn by the same underlying logic that had drawn the Portuguese there a century earlier. Whoever sits astride this choke point holds leverage over trade routes far larger than the strait itself, and that leverage doesn't require owning the surrounding territory, only controlling the passage through it. The goods moving through this corridor across these centuries illustrate just how much was actually at stake for the empires competing over it. Gulf pearls prized across European and Mughal courts, spices and textiles moving west from India, and later, horses bred on the Persian plateau shipped east to supply Indian cavalries, all funneled through this same narrow passage, regardless of which flag happened to fly over the fortress on Hormuz Island in any given century. By the 20th century, the discovery of vast oil reserves throughout the Persian Gulf region transformed this ancient choke point from a valuable trade corridor into something categorically more significant. The single passage through which an increasingly oil-dependent global economy would need to move an enormous share of its energy supply. The stakes attached to this narrow stretch of water didn't just grow. They changed in kind, from commercial advantage to something closer to civilizational necessity, setting the stage for a new century of confrontation that would prove, repeatedly, just how much leverage a single geographic choke point could still exert in a world of aircraft carriers and satellite surveillance. The clearest illustration of what this choke point's leverage actually means in practice came not from a dispute over trade routes, but from a war between two neighboring states that happened to be fought, in part, in the waters leading directly to the strait. Here are the facts stated plainly, as any serious account of this period should. Beginning in September 1980, Iran and Iraq fought a brutal 8-year war along their shared border, a conflict rooted in territorial disputes over the Shatt al-Arab waterway, regional rivalry between two of the Gulf's most powerful states, and the ambitions of Iraq's government under Saddam Hussein following the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which Baghdad viewed as an opportunity to seize territory while its neighbor was consumed by internal upheaval. By the mid-1980s, both combatants had extended the war onto the water, attacking merchant tankers carrying oil in and out of the Gulf in an effort to damage each other's wartime economies and cut off the revenue. Each side depended on to continue fighting, a period that came to be known internationally as the Tanker War. Foreign vessels, including those flagged by neutral nations with no direct stake in the conflict, increasingly found themselves caught in the crossfire, struck by missiles, mines, and gunfire from both sides. By 1987, over 400 merchant ships had reportedly been attacked in the Gulf, and the United States had begun escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Gulf specifically to protect the flow of oil through the strait from becoming collateral damage in a war between its neighbors, a program known as Operation Earnest Will. That escort program ultimately grew into the largest convoy operation the U.S. Navy had conducted since the Second World War, involving dozens of warships rotating through the Gulf to shepherd reflagged tankers past the most dangerous stretches of water, a scale of continuous naval commitment that itself signaled how seriously Washington treated the basic principle of keeping the strait's approaches open to commercial traffic, independent of whichever side in the broader war happened to be responsible for a given attack. That escort mission set the stage for the incident that would become the clearest historical proof of how seriously outside powers treat any threat to this chokepoint's stability. On April 14, 1988, the American frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts struck a naval mine in the Persian Gulf, laid by Iranian forces as part of the broader tanker war, tearing a massive hole in the ship's hull, severely damaging the vessel, and injuring several sailors aboard, though remarkably causing no fatalities thanks to the crew's rapid damage control efforts that kept the frigate afloat long enough to be towed to safety. In direct response, on April 18, 1988, the United States launched Operation Praying Mantis, a one-day military operation targeting Iranian naval assets and offshore oil platforms believed to be involved in mine-laying and attacks on shipping throughout the preceding months. Over the course of that single day, American naval and air forces destroyed or severely damaged two Iranian offshore oil platforms, the Sasan and Siri platforms, being used for military surveillance and coordination of attacks, sank or disabled several Iranian naval vessels, including the frigate Sahand and multiple fast attack boats, and inflicted losses that represented, at the time, the largest single-day surface naval engagement the United States Navy had fought since the Second World War. American forces sustained minimal losses in the operation by comparison, losing 2 crew members aboard a helicopter in an unrelated accident during the same engagement. The scale of that response is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something essential about how seriously major powers treat threats to this specific waterway, separate from any judgment about the broader Iran-Iraq war itself. This wasn't a proportional retaliation calibrated purely to the damage of one mine strike against one frigate. It was a demonstration, aimed as much at every other actor watching from the region and beyond as at Iran itself, that interference with the free flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz would draw a response disproportionate to almost any provocation that triggered it. The message embedded in Operation Praying Mantis wasn't really about Iran and Iraq's war at all, a conflict the United States remained formally neutral in throughout most of its duration. It was about the strait itself and about establishing, in the clearest possible terms, that no regional power would be permitted to threaten its stability without consequence, regardless of the broader justification offered for doing so. What makes 1988 especially significant for understanding this choke point's ongoing leverage is what happened next. Essentially nothing, in terms of long-term closure or disruption to the strait's basic function. The strait remained open throughout and after the operation. Oil kept moving through it within days. The Iran-Iraq war itself ground on for several more months before ending in a ceasefire in August 1988, largely along the same territorial lines that existed before the war began 8 years earlier, at a cost historians estimate at somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million lives on both sides combined. From a narrow military standpoint focused purely on the strait's operational status, remarkably little had permanently changed as a direct result of Operation Praying Mantis. And yet, the episode became a foundational case study, studied by naval strategists and energy analysts alike in the decades since, in exactly how disproportionate the global response to any threat against this specific stretch of water would be. A pattern that would repeat itself, in different form, more than 2 decades later, once the immediate context of the Iran-Iraq War had long since faded into history, and an entirely new generation of officials on every side had taken over the decisions that would define the next chapter of this same recurring standoff. If 1988 demonstrated what happens when an actual military incident touches the strait, the episode that unfolded between 2011 and 2012 demonstrated something arguably more revealing. That merely threatening to close the strait without a single shot fired was enough to send tremors through the global economy. The context, stated factually, throughout 2011 and into 2012, the United States and its European allies steadily escalated economic sanctions against Iran, targeting the country's oil exports and financial sector, including measures aimed at Iran's central bank in an effort to pressure Tehran's government over its nuclear program, which Western governments and international inspectors believed had military dimensions that Iran denied. In response, senior Iranian officials, including then Vice President Mohammad Reza Rahimi and figures within Iran's military leadership, such as the commander of Iran's Navy, issued a series of public statements throughout late 2011 and early 2012, warning that if sanctions succeeded in blocking Iran's own oil exports, Iran retained the capability and the willingness to close the Strait of Hormuz entirely, halting the flow of oil not just for itself, but for every nation dependent on Gulf crude passing through it. This was, in the most literal sense, a threat rather than an action. And yet the global economic response to that threat alone illustrates precisely how much leverage this choke point carries, independent of anything actually happening on the water. Oil prices moved measurably on the strength of Iranian rhetoric alone, with benchmark Brent crude prices climbing amid market anxiety over the mere possibility of disruption to a passage carrying roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil trade at the time. The European Union, moving in parallel with American sanctions, announced in early 2012 an embargo on Iranian oil imports set to take full effect that summer, a decision that itself contributed to the climate of uncertainty since it meant Iran's own economic pressure to retaliate was rising at precisely the same moment its rhetoric around the strait was intensifying. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Gulf rose noticeably during this period. Shipping companies began quietly reviewing contingency routes, despite the fact that no viable large-scale alternative to the strait actually exists for the majority of Gulf oil exports, since pipeline capacity bypassing the strait, run mainly through Saudi Arabia and the UAE, covered only a fraction of total regional output at the time. Financial markets, in other words, were pricing in the mere possibility of closure as though it carried real probability, based almost entirely on public statements from Iranian officials rather than any observed large-scale military preparation to actually execute a blockade of the passage. The United States and its allies responded to these threats with the same disproportionate seriousness that had characterized Operation Praying Mantis over 2 decades earlier. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain specifically because of its proximity to the strait, conducted visible naval exercises throughout this period, and American officials, including senior defense and military leadership, stated publicly and repeatedly that any Iranian attempt to actually close the strait would be treated as an act that the United States and its regional partners would act to reverse by force if necessary. Aircraft carrier strike groups transited the strait during this window in what were widely understood by regional analysts and international media covering the standoff as deliberate demonstrations of naval capability intended to reinforce that message without requiring it to be tested directly through actual conflict. Not every major power responded identically, and that divergence is itself instructive. China and Russia, both significant purchasers of Iranian oil and both more skeptical of the sanctions regime driving the crisis in the first place, generally avoided the same escalatory rhetoric coming from Washington, while still relying, without saying so directly, on the American security guarantee to keep the strait open for their own tankers, regardless of how they characterize the underlying dispute diplomatically. Ultimately, Iran never attempted to close the strait during this period, and by mid-2012, the acute phase of the crisis had eased considerably, even as broader sanctions and nuclear negotiations between Iran and world powers continued for years afterward through entirely separate diplomatic channels that eventually produced the 2015 nuclear agreement. It's worth being precise about the scale of what was actually at stake in market terms during this window. At the height of the rhetorical standoff, oil analysts and government agencies openly discussed scenarios in which even a temporary closure of the strait could remove several million barrels of daily supply from global markets simultaneously, a shock large enough that multiple governments, including the United States, signaled willingness to release strategic petroleum reserves specifically to blunt the impact of any actual disruption. That level of contingency planning, mobilized in response to statements rather than actions, is itself a measure of how much weight this single choke point carries in the calculations of governments that have never directly controlled a single mile of its shoreline. Energy economists at the time noted a specific phenomenon worth naming directly. Unlike most commodities, where price reflects primarily supply and demand fundamentals, oil prices around the strait during this period were trading substantially on pure geopolitical risk premium, a measurable gap between what supply and demand alone would predict and what markets were actually charging, driven almost entirely by the credibility analysts assigned to Iranian threats rather than any change in the physical volume of oil actually moving. What the 2011 to 2012 episode left behind wasn't a change in who controlled the strait or how it operated day to day. It left behind a clearer demonstration than perhaps any prior episode of a specific, measurable phenomenon. This choke point's economic significance is now so deeply priced into global markets that the mere credible possibility of disruption, entirely independent of any actual military action, can move oil prices, insurance markets, and diplomatic posturing on a truly global scale. The strait, in other words, had become powerful enough that simply invoking its name in a threat now functioned as a form of leverage entirely in its own right, separate from whether that threat was ever remotely likely to be carried out. 7 years later, a third episode reinforced the same underlying pattern in a form closer to 1988 than to the purely rhetorical standoff of 2011, involving actual attacks on shipping rather than statements alone, while still stopping well short of any full closure of the strait. The documented sequence of events again stated plainly. In May and June of 2019, a series of attacks damaged multiple commercial oil tankers in and around the Gulf of Oman, near the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz, including the Norwegian-owned Front Altair and the Japanese-owned Kokuka Courageous, both attacked on June 13th in an incident that drew particular international attention given the timing, coinciding with a visit by the Japanese Prime Minister to Tehran aimed at easing regional tensions. Investigations by the United States and several allied governments concluded that the attacks involved limpet mines, explosive devices attached below a vessel's waterline by divers, and publicly attributed responsibility for the attacks to Iran. An assessment based partly on video evidence the U.S. military released showing what it described as an Iranian patrol boat removing an unexploded mine from one of the damaged tankers. Iran's government denied any involvement in the attacks and rejected the American evidence as inconclusive. In June 2019, Iranian forces shot down a U.S. Navy surveillance drone, an RQ-4 Global Hawk, that Iran stated had entered its airspace over the strait, a claim the United States disputed, asserting the drone had remained over international waters throughout its flight. Later that summer, in July 2019, Iranian naval forces seized a British-flagged tanker, the Stena Impero, in the strait, an action that followed the earlier seizure of an Iranian tanker, the Grace One, by British Royal Marines near Gibraltar over suspected violations of European Union sanctions on oil shipments to Syria. A tit-for-tat sequence that further elevated tensions throughout the region over the following weeks. Each of these individual incidents, examined on its own, might have registered as a regional dispute contained to diplomatic channels. Examined together, across a compressed span of a few months, they produced exactly the kind of market reaction the 2011 to 2012 episode had previewed, but now grounded in actual attacks and seizures rather than rhetoric alone. Oil prices spiked measurably in the immediate aftermath of the tanker attacks in May and June, with benchmark crude climbing several percentage points within hours of each incident before settling as the immediate shock passed. Maritime insurers sharply increased premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf, with some categories of war risk insurance becoming dramatically more expensive within days of the incidents. In some reported cases, rising by a factor of 10 or more for a single transit through the strait, a cost increase that shipping companies ultimately passed along the supply chain in the form of higher freight rates for the oil moving through the passage. Several major shipping and tanker companies temporarily rerouted or paused transits through the strait entirely during the most acute weeks of the crisis, absorbing significant additional cost and delay rather than risk vessels and crews in what insurers and ship owners alike were now treating as an elevated risk corridor requiring specialized coverage. The international response, once again, emphasized deterrence over resolution, echoing the same underlying logic that had shaped both the 1988 and 2011 to 2012 episodes. The United States announced an International Maritime Security Initiative, later formalized as the International Maritime Security Construct, specifically focused on safeguarding shipping in the Strait and the broader Gulf of Oman, eventually joined by a coalition of partner nations, including the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Albania, and several other states contributing naval assets to escort and monitor commercial traffic through the passage. Notably, some traditional American allies, including several European governments, declined to join this specific American-led coalition, instead standing up a parallel European-led maritime surveillance mission months later, a divergence that itself reflected differing assessments among allied governments about how directly to align with the United States' broader posture toward Iran at that particular moment, even as all parties agreed on the underlying necessity of keeping the strait open. This wasn't a peacekeeping mission in the conventional sense. It was, in substance, the same underlying message that Operation Praying Mantis and the 2012 carrier transits had already sent, updated for a new decade. Any actor attempting to meaningfully disrupt traffic through this choke point would face a coordinated, multinational naval response, rather than simply a bilateral one between two governments. By late 2019, the acute phase of that specific episode had also subsided. The strait remained open throughout, and global oil traffic continued moving through it largely uninterrupted despite the tanker attacks, the drone incident, and the tanker seizures on both sides. It's worth noting how quickly the shipping industry itself adapted to this elevated risk environment rather than abandoning the route entirely, since abandoning it was never really a viable option given the absence of alternatives. Tankers began traveling in tighter convoys. Some flagged vessels temporarily switched registries to reduce their perceived risk profile, and naval escorts from the newly formed coalition became a routine feature of transits through the strait for the following several years, quietly absorbed into the standard operating cost of moving oil through this specific stretch of water. 3 separate historical episodes, spanning 3 different decades, 3 different sets of proximate causes, and 3 different levels of escalation, had each produced the same essential outcome: significant international response, real economic and military consequences, genuine and measurable market disruption. And yet, in every single case, the strait itself remained functionally open to the shipping traffic the entire world depended on. That consistency, across such different circumstances and such different decades, is itself the most important pattern this particular history has to offer. Anyone trying to understand how this choke point actually functions. Step back from the specific dates and specific incidents, and a clearer picture comes into focus. One that connects directly to the same underlying principle this channel keeps returning to across every choke point we've examined. Geography, at certain rare points on the map, creates leverage that has almost nothing to do with the size or wealth of the nation that happens to control it. Iran, geographically, controls the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, a coastline stretching from Bandar Abbas out toward the mouth of the Gulf. Oman controls the southern shore, through the rugged, fjord-like Musandam Peninsula, an exclave separated from the rest of Omani territory by a strip of the United Arab Emirates. Neither nation, measured by conventional metrics of economic output or military spending, ranks among the world's dominant states in the way the United States, China, or the major European powers do. And yet, across 5 centuries, control of this specific 33-kilometer passage has repeatedly forced far larger powers. The Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Republic, the British Empire, and in the modern era, the United States, into direct, sustained, and expensive engagement with whatever government happened to sit astride it. That's the same fundamental logic this channel traced through the Panama Canal earlier in this series. A nation's size on a map rarely determines its actual leverage over global affairs. Position does, and position is a form of power that money alone cannot simply purchase or relocate to somewhere more convenient. What the 3 modern episodes, 1988, 2011 to 2012, and 2019, collectively demonstrate is something more specific than simply, this choke point matters. They demonstrate that the strait's leverage now operates on 2 entirely separate tracks simultaneously, and that outside powers have learned, through repeated experience, to treat both tracks with equal seriousness. The first track is physical. An actual mine, an actual seized tanker, an actual military engagement, the kind of concrete event that occurred in 1988 and again in 2019. The second track is almost entirely psychological. A public statement, a diplomatic threat, a rhetorical warning that the strait could be closed, the kind of event that dominated 2011 and 2012 without a single shot being fired in anger. Remarkably, financial markets, insurance underwriters, and naval planners now respond to both tracks with comparable urgency because both tracks tap into the exact same underlying vulnerability. A global economy that has never developed a viable large-scale alternative route for the roughly 1/5 of the world's oil that depends on this single passage remaining open every single day. No pipeline network built to date, and none currently under serious construction anywhere in the region, comes close to replacing the volume this one stretch of water carries, which is precisely why every threat against it, credible or not, continues to command attention that would seem wildly disproportionate applied to almost any other stretch of ocean on the planet. That vulnerability is, in the most literal sense, why no single actor has ever fully closed the strait despite decades of intermittent threats and incidents stretching back across multiple generations of leadership on every side. Iran depends on this passage for its own oil exports just as much as its adversaries depend on it for their imports, a mutual dependency that has functioned, across every episode examined here, as its own form of restraint, even amid serious escalation and genuinely dangerous incidents at sea. It's a dynamic that echoes, on a regional and economic scale, the same logic that kept nuclear-armed superpowers from direct conflict during the Cold War. Not goodwill, but the shared recognition that the cost of actually following through on a threat, this severe, would land on the party issuing it almost as hard as on anyone else. The United States and its allies, for their part, have consistently demonstrated a willingness to respond to any threat against the strait with force disproportionate to the provocation itself, precisely because the alternative, a world in which this choke point's neutrality could genuinely be called into question on a sustained basis, represents a risk to the global economy that no policymaker, regardless of party or administration, has been willing to accept as tolerable in any of the decades this video has examined. This is, ultimately, what makes the Strait of Hormuz such a clear illustration of the broader thesis. This channel keeps circling back to across every video in this series, that certain narrow points on the map accumulate a kind of gravitational pull on global power entirely disproportionate to their physical size, and that this gravitational pull persists across empires, across ideologies, and across entirely different eras of naval technology, because the underlying geography never changes even as everything built on top of it does. It's a pattern this channel has traced before, in the Panama Canal's 50 miles of engineered water, and it's a pattern that recurs at a small handful of other choke points scattered around the globe. The Strait of Malacca, through which much of the trade moving between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific must pass, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the mouth of the Red Sea, each of them narrow enough, and each of them unavoidable enough, that the nations controlling their shores have found themselves, again and again, holding leverage that has nothing to do with the size of their economies or the reach of their armies. Portuguese fortresses gave way to American carrier strike groups. Sailing galleons gave way to supertankers carrying more oil in a single voyage than entire nations consume in a week. But the 33 kilometers of water itself has remained, across 500 years and 5 distinct eras of global power, the same immovable fact that every empire operating in this region has eventually had to reckon with, regardless of how advanced its ships or how powerful its navy happened to be at the time. It's a humbling thought for any great power to sit with, and yet each one, in turn, has been forced to sit with it anyway. Geology drew this map long before any empire existed to contest it, and geology will still be drawing it long after every flag currently flying over its shores has been replaced by another. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the 5-minute headline version, but the slower one, where you actually trace a pattern across centuries instead of a single news cycle. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because there's a question worth sitting with, given everything we've just traced across 3 separate decades. Does this pattern hold indefinitely, or is there some threshold of escalation that finally breaks it? History, at least the history examined in this video, offers a fairly consistent answer through 1988, through 2011 and 2012, and through 2019. Serious incidents, serious rhetoric, serious market disruption. And in every case, the strait itself remaining functionally open, restrained by the same mutual dependency that has held for decades, regardless of which government sat in power on either shore. As of this recording, tensions in the region surrounding the strait remain active and unresolved, a live and unfolding situation this video has deliberately not covered in any detail, because our focus here has been squarely on the historical pattern those 3 earlier episodes establish, not on analyzing events that are still actively in progress and whose outcome nobody watching this can yet know with any confidence. What this history does leave us with is a clear framework for understanding why a passage this narrow keeps reappearing at the center of global anxiety, decade after decade, regardless of who governs the shores on either side of it, or what specific dispute happens to be driving the headlines in any given year. Because choke points like this one don't operate on the news cycle. They operate on geological and economic timescales that outlast any single crisis, any single administration, any single year's headlines, which is precisely why understanding the pattern matters more than following any individual episode of it. A viewer trying to make sense of whatever is happening in this region in any given month will always be better served by understanding the 500-year pattern than by treating that month's headlines as something genuinely new under the sun. And that's precisely the thread worth following into the next chapter of this series. Because Hormuz isn't the only place on Earth where a narrow accident of geography has repeatedly forced the world's most powerful nations to the table. There's another passage, thousands of miles away, considerably less famous, but arguably even more consequential to the century ahead, where a different set of great powers are, right now, discovering exactly the same lesson this strait taught the Portuguese 500 years ago. Here's what stays with me about this story, long after the specific dates and incidents fade into the background. 5 different eras of global power, Persian, Portuguese, Dutch, British, American, have each, in turn, arrived at the same 33 kilometers of water and reached the identical conclusion. Whoever can influence what happens here holds something no amount of territory elsewhere can replace. Empires that could project military force across entire continents still found themselves negotiating, threatening, building fortresses, and stationing fleets around one narrow channel that no amount of wealth or technology has ever allowed anyone to simply route around. That's the part of this story that outlasts any individual episode. Not the mine that struck the USS Samuel B. Roberts, not the Rhetoric of 2012, not the tankers seized in 2019. What outlasts all of it is the water itself, indifferent to whichever empire happens to be paying attention to it in a given century, still exactly as narrow, still exactly as unavoidable, still forcing the same calculation onto whoever holds power at that particular moment. Negotiate with this choke point, or pay the price of ignoring it. Every one of the 5 powers examined in this video arrived at that same crossroads eventually, whether they were sailing galleons flying Portuguese colors in 1507 or piloting a guided missile frigate under an American flag in 1988. The technology changed completely. The lesson never did. Geography rarely announces its own importance loudly. It just sits there, patient, until the world's economy grows dependent enough on what passes through it that even a rumor of disruption can move markets on the other side of the planet. The Strait of Hormuz has been making that same quiet argument for 500 years, to 5 different empires, in 5 different languages, and every single one of them eventually learned to listen, whether they arrived believing they would or not. There's a particular kind of humility in that pattern, if you sit with it long enough. Empires that could reshape continents, that could topple governments an ocean away, still found themselves negotiating with 33 kilometers of water that never once asked for their attention and never once needed it. The strait doesn't require an empire's respect to matter. It simply waits for whichever power happens to be paying attention that century to work out, usually the hard way, exactly how much it actually costs to ignore it. 5 different flags have flown over Hormuz Island since Albuquerque first raised the Portuguese banner there in 1507, and the water beneath every one of them has asked the exact same question of whoever claimed to control it. Are you prepared to keep this passage open, or are you prepared to pay what it costs when someone else decides to test whether you actually are? If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this. Leave a comment. Tell me honestly what you thought, and tell me what choke point you want us to trace next. Because somewhere else on the map, right now, another narrow strip of water is quietly deciding more than anyone realizes.